I'm Avery May, and I was 34 the week my grandfather's whole life got signed over to the man who never once read a page of it. Walt May built a feed and grain store and a home place out of nothing. He died on a Tuesday, and by Friday my father stood on the porch and told me I'd inherit dust. He said it in front of the family, smiling. My father made one mistake that week, though. He forgot who kept the books. And the night after the funeral, a stranger I'd never seen knocked on my door with an envelope and told me it was time to stop being quiet. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally get heard. Stories about answering cruelty with calm and shame with the truth. If that's you, your family here, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Before any of this, there was a brass bell on a wooden counter and the smell of grain dust thick enough to taste. May Brothers Feed and Grain sat at the edge of a small Ohio town, and I grew up behind that counter. I was 9 the first time my grandfather let me ring up a sale. I was 11 when he handed me the green ledger and a ballpoint and said the numbers were mine to keep now. Walt May had hands like work gloves and a memory like a steel trap, but he trusted ink over both. Every bag of feed, every account, every dollar owed went into that ledger in my small, careful hand. He stood over me, not to correct me, but to watch me get it right. People in town owed him money for years and he never chased a soul, but he always knew the figure. I asked him once why he wrote everything down when he remembered all of it anyway. He set down his coffee and looked at me for a long moment. The books don't lie, Avery. People do. I was a kid. I thought it was just something old men said. I tucked it away and kept writing, line after line, season after season, while my father stayed up at the house and my uncle drifted off to the city. For 23 years that bell rang and I knew every sound the store made. Then Walt got sick in the spring, and the store went quiet, and the ledger went into a drawer. He passed in late September. 3 days later the bell rang for a stranger I didn't recognize, and nothing about my family was ever the same again. The funeral was small, and the casseroles were endless. Half the county came through the church basement, because Walt had carried half the county on credit at one time or another. My father, Dale, worked the room like a man running for office. He shook every hand and accepted every condolence, and somewhere in there he started using the word estate, like it belonged to him alone. I didn't think much of it that first day. Grief makes people grab for things. But the next morning he already had the keys to the home place and a lawyer's card in his shirt pocket, and a tone I didn't like. I found him in Walt's kitchen and asked the simple question, "When do we read the will?" Dale didn't even look up from his coffee. "There's no will," he said. "Pa never made one." I stood there with the refrigerator humming and felt the floor tilt. Because I knew that wasn't true. 6 years back, Walt had asked me to drive him into the county seat to a lawyer named Harold Pruitt. I'd sat in the waiting room with a magazine. I'd watched through the glass while my grandfather signed his name to a thick stack of papers, and a gray-haired woman stamped each page. He'd come out folding his glasses and told me he'd finally put his house in order. So I looked at my father across that kitchen and I said it plainly. "I drove him to sign one, Dad." I was there. Dale set his cup down slow. His jaw worked once. Then he said, "Memory plays tricks on grieving girls," and he walked out, and the screen door banged behind him like a verdict. It came to a head that Friday on the porch of the home place, with cousins and neighbors still lingering after the burial. Dale had gathered everyone the way Walt used to gather them, except Walt did it for hog roasts, and my father did it to hold court. He stood on the top step where my grandfather always stood. He announced that since there was no will, he'd be filing as administrator of the estate. He said the law made him the man in charge of all of it. The store, the land, the home place, every acre Walt ever turned. Then his eyes found me at the bottom of the steps, and his mouth curled into something I'd been seeing my whole life. "You won't get a single cent," he said. "Cole's the next heir." He said it loud enough for the porch to hear, and a few people chuckled the way people do when they're uncomfortable and want to be on the winning side. I felt my face go hot. Cole, my younger brother, stared at his shoes. I didn't argue. That surprised them, I think. They wanted me to cry or shout so they could call me hysterical and move on. Instead, I just nodded, like he'd told me the weather. Then I climbed the steps past him and walked through that front door I'd walked through 10,000 times, and the screen door latched shut behind me with the same soft click it always made. Except this time, it sounded like a lock. I got my purse off the hall table. I drove the 9 miles back to my apartment in town, and I started doing the only thing I've ever been good at when I'm scared. I started writing it all down. Here's the thing. Nobody in my family ever understood about me. They mistook quiet for agreement. For as long as I can remember, I was the one who handled the hard paperwork. When my mother passed, I filed the forms. When Cole totaled his truck at 19, I sorted the insurance. When the store needed its sales tax filing, I drove out on Sundays and did it free. I told myself I did it out of love, and mostly that was true. But somewhere along the line, my doing it quietly turned into everyone assuming I'd always do it quietly and never ask for anything back. So when Dale told the porch I'd get nothing, part of him truly believed I'd just absorb it. Avery handles things. Avery doesn't make a fuss. That was the family scripture. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, I finally saw the cost of it. My whole life, I'd kept everyone's books and never once put myself in the ledger. I work as a paralegal now. Probate and estates, of all things. I spend my days helping strangers navigate exactly the kind of mess my father was trying to build. And I'd been so busy being the good daughter that I'd almost forgotten I knew precisely how this machine worked. Administrators don't simply keep everything. There are rules, there are filings, there are duties a court can enforce. I poured a second cup of coffee I didn't need. I pulled out a legal pad. At the top, I wrote one word, the way Walt taught me to start any account I didn't yet understand. Questions. And underneath it, the first one. If there's no will, why is my father acting like he owns it all instead of just managing it? Monday, I did what I tell every nervous client to do. I went to the source. Probate filings are public record, so I drove to the county courthouse on my lunch break and pulled the case my father had opened. It was all there in black and white. Dale May, petitioning for appointment as administrator of the intestate estate of Walter J. May. His attorney of record was a man named Garrett Voss, a name I knew from the wrong side of a few firm cases. The petition listed the assets like a grocery run. The store, valued low, 200 acres in 3 parcels, the home place. And it listed the heirs at law. Under our state's intestate succession, with my grandfather leaving no spouse and my father his only living child, the whole estate passed to Dale. Not divided, not shared. To him. Cole and I were Walt's grandchildren, but our line to Walt ran straight through our father, and the law doesn't let grandchildren reach around a living parent to inherit. Our late mother had married into this family, not been born to it, so nothing flowed down through her. That part is what tightened my stomach, because it meant my father wasn't lying about the law. He was right about it. If there truly was no will, then the porch was the law, and I'd get nothing, and Cole would get nothing either, no matter which of us Dale named on the steps. So the law wasn't my father's mistake, it was his cover. Either Walt had died with no will at all, or someone wanted the whole family to believe he had. I copied every page. I sat in my car in the courthouse lot and read it twice. Voss had moved fast, faster than grief usually allows, requesting that Dale be appointed sole administrator with full authority and minimal court supervision. Independent administration, they call it. Less oversight. Less paperwork between my father and the assets. I closed the folder and watched a county truck idle by. Administrators don't get to keep everything, I said out loud, to no one. So why was he so sure he could? I didn't go knock on my father's door and scream. That's not how you fight someone holding all the keys. You make them put things in writing. As an heir at law, I had a clean legal right to information, so I drafted a formal request the way I'd draft it for any client. A short letter to Garrett Voss, asking for a full inventory of estate assets and an accounting of any transactions since my grandfather's death. Polite, dated, certified mail, return receipt. I kept a copy. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything yet. I was simply turning on the lights. I mailed it Tuesday, and I waited. I'm not going to pretend my hands didn't shake when I dropped it in the slot. Walt had been gone less than 2 weeks. Part of me whispered that I was tearing a wound open at the worst possible time, that a good daughter would let the family grieve. But I'd learned something in 7 years of probate work. The damage almost always happens in the quiet weeks right after a death, while everyone is too sad and too polite to look. The response came in 4 days on Voss's letterhead, and it was not an inventory. It was a warning. Mr. Voss wrote that my inquiries were causing distress to a grieving family, that the estate was in its earliest stages, and that further harassment would be documented. No numbers, no list, just a velvet threat. I read it twice and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest, the feeling I get right before I finally understand a case. People who have nothing to hide hand you the inventory. People who stall are hiding the inventory. The only question left was what. Cole showed up at my apartment that weekend, and I almost didn't recognize my own brother. He's 29, 4 years younger than me, and he'd always been the easy one. Charming, restless, perpetually one good idea away from being rich. He'd sunk his savings into a landscaping venture that folded, and now he had a newborn and a stack of bills and a face that hadn't slept. He stood in my doorway holding a grocery store pie like a peace offering. "Dad says you're going to drag Grandpa's name through court," he said. I let him in. I cut the pie. I asked how the baby was sleeping and watched him soften and then catch himself. Like softness was a betrayal of his orders. He'd clearly been sent. He told me Dad was only trying to keep the business in the family, that I was being ungrateful, that Walt would have wanted a man running things. He used Dad's exact words, in Dad's exact rhythm, and I realized my brother had become a tape recorder for a man who'd never once been kind to him without a reason. I didn't take the bait. I just slid the courthouse copies across the table and asked him one question. "Did you read what you signed, Cole?" His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He blinked. He looked at the papers and then at me, and for just a second the recording glitched. "What do you mean what I signed?" he said, too fast. I tapped the line on the petition where his signature sat, agreeing to support Dale's appointment, waiving his own right to object. His face went the color of the kitchen wall. He didn't know. My father had walked my exhausted, frightened brother through a stack of documents, and Cole had signed wherever the pen pointed. And that was the moment I stopped being only angry and started being careful. If you're the one in your family who always handled the hard paperwork, the one everyone assumed would just go quiet again, then you already know how this feels in your chest. Before we go further, if Avery's story is hitting close to home, subscribe and stay with me. You're going to want to be here for what the stranger left at her door. The refusals came in a pattern after that, and the pattern told me more than any answer could have. I wrote again, citing the specific statute that gives heirs the right to an accounting. Voss replied that it was premature. I requested the date of the inventory's filing. He replied that the estate's affairs were complex. Every letter was courteous, and every letter said nothing, and that is its own kind of confession. An administrator has a fiduciary duty. That's not a soft word. It means my father was legally bound to act in the best interest of every heir, to stay honest, to keep us informed, and to hand over an accounting when asked. Stonewalling isn't a strategy a clean administrator needs. So while Voss ran out the clock, I started building something only I could build. I sat down and reconstructed the store's finances from memory and from the old receipts I still had in my own files from doing the books. 23 years of numbers live somewhere in my head. I knew roughly what the store cleared, what the land leased for, what Walt kept in his accounts at the bank on Main Street. I built a shadow ledger, line by line, of what the estate should reasonably contain. Then I held it up against the few crumbs my father had let slip on that porch, his talk of debts and a struggling store, and barely enough to bury Walt properly. The numbers didn't touch, not even close. The man had described a near-empty estate. The math in my head described something substantial. One of those pictures was a lie, and I knew which one of them lied for a living. So I underlined the gap on my legal pad and wrote a second question beneath the first. Where did it go? To answer that, I needed records, and I had exactly one set my father couldn't snatch back. After Walt got sick, I'd brought home a folder of old receipts and bank slips to help me square his last few filings. They'd been sitting in my hall closet the whole time. I spread them across my kitchen table on a Sunday and let the green ledger sit beside them in my memory, my grandfather's slanted hand filling every column. And there it was, the thing that doesn't lie. Among the slips were 2 land transfers I had never recorded, dated 4 months before Walt died, right in the thick of his illness. 2 of the 3 parcels quietly deeded from Walt to a limited liability company I'd never heard of, Riverbend Holdings. The price listed was a fraction of what that ground was worth. I knew that land. I'd watched men bid on a single acre of it for more. And the signature on the transfer, the one meant to be my grandfather's, stopped me cold. I'd kept Walt's books for 23 years. I knew his signature the way I know my own face. This was a fair forgery. Careful even. But the line was wrong. Walt signed with a hard downstroke on the W, a habit from a man who'd learned penmanship in 1955. This W was timid. The hand was steady where his hand, by then, shook from the medication. I sat back in my chair and the kitchen went very still. Grandpa's hand never shook like that, I whispered. Then I pulled my phone toward me and started searching the state's business registry for the one piece that would turn a suspicion into a fact. Who, exactly, owned Riverbend Holdings? Before I could finish chasing that thread, my father changed tactics. The threats hadn't moved me, so he tried sugar. He called on a Wednesday evening, voice warm as a stove, calling me kiddo for the first time in a decade. He said the family was being torn apart, that Walt would be heartbroken to see us fight. Then he got to it. He wanted me to sign a family settlement agreement, a single page that would have me waive any claim to the estate to keep things peaceful. Just sign it, he said, and we put this ugliness behind us. While he talked, I heard Sharon, his wife, in the background, prompting him. Then she took the phone. Think of Cole's baby, she said softly. Do you really want to take food off a newborn's plate over pride? That's the move, you see. It's never give me the money. It's always, you're hurting a child by asking questions. Emotional blackmail dressed up as conscience. A year ago, it might have worked on me, but I'd spent 7 years watching this exact play run on grieving people in my office, and I knew the counter. You don't refuse outright and start a war you're not ready for. You buy time. So I made my voice as warm as his. I told him I understood, that I needed a few days to read it carefully, since I read everything carefully. It's just how I'm built. He liked that. He thought my caution was weakness, the same way he always had. We hung up almost friendly. Then I set the unsigned page on my table next to the forged land deed, and I let myself feel, just for a second, the cold satisfaction of a man underestimating exactly the wrong person. The forged deed and the empty inventory pointed one direction, but I needed the will to win, and the will was a ghost. I remembered the lawyer's name, Harold Pruitt, the office in the county seat with the dusty law books and the gray-haired woman who stamped the pages. So I drove the 40 minutes out there on a gray Saturday, ledger of questions on the passenger seat. The office was gone. The little brick storefront had a for-lease sign and a realtor's number and a window full of dead flies. I called the realtor from the curb. Pruitt had passed 2 years back, she told me. The practice closed. The files supposedly transferred or returned to clients. Supposedly. No one knew where Walt's file went. I tried the County Bar Association. I tried the records office. I left messages that went nowhere. Every door I knocked on had been closed before I got there. Sitting in my car outside that empty office, I felt the case slipping. Without the original will, or even a copy, I had a forged deed and a stalling father and a strong feeling, and feelings don't win in probate court. The law has a brutal little rule for exactly this. If a will was last known to be in the testator's possession and can't be found after death, the court presumes he destroyed it himself, that he meant to revoke it. The missing will would be read as no will. My father wouldn't even need to admit he'd burned it. The law would do his lying for him. I drove the 40 minutes home in the dark, defeated for the first time, trying to figure out my next move. And when I pulled into my lot, there was a woman standing under the light by my door, waiting. She was easily 70, in a sensible coat, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing behind a counter herself. She wasn't threatening. She was patient, like she'd been prepared to wait all night. I got out slow, keys laced through my fingers the way my mother taught me. "Are you Avery?" she asked. "Walt's granddaughter, the one who kept his books?" The fact that she knew that, knew the books, made me stop. I said I was. She told me her name was Ruth Halloran, and that for 31 years she'd been the secretary and notary for Harold Pruitt. The gray-haired woman, the one who'd stamped my grandfather's pages while I read a magazine in the waiting room 6 years ago. She said she'd seen Walt's obituary, and then she'd seen the probate notice in the county paper, the one announcing his estate was being handled as if he'd died intestate, as if he'd died without a will, and she said she'd lain awake 3 nights over it, because she knew that wasn't so. She'd watched him sign one. She'd stamped it herself. I felt my pulse in my ears. I asked why she was telling me, and not the court. She said the court hadn't asked, and that some things you have to carry to the right person yourself. Then she looked at me with eyes that had notarized 1,000 last wishes and watched most of them get honored and a few of them get stolen. "It's time to tell them who you really are," she said quietly. And from her coat she drew a plain envelope, soft with handling, and held it out to me in the cold light of the parking lot. I didn't open it right away. Somehow I knew that once I did, there was no closing it again. I made her come inside out of the cold, and I made coffee with shaking hands, and then I opened it at my kitchen table where I'd opened everything else. 3 things slid out. The first was a photocopy, a conformed copy, of the last will and testament of Walter J. May, dated 6 years prior, every page initialed, the signatures clear. I read it twice while Ruth sipped her coffee. It did not crown a single heir. It left the store and the home place to be held jointly by Cole and me, the 2 grandchildren who'd carried Walt's name and Walt's work, with a fair cash share set aside for Dale. Not nothing, a son's portion, but not the kingdom, and not the crown. The second thing was a single page photocopied from a notary journal, Ruth's own logbook, recording the date, the document, my grandfather's signature, and her stamp. The third was an index card with a name and a faded phone number, Earl Dabney. The second witness, Ruth explained, an old store hand who'd signed alongside her that day. I sat there holding proof my grandfather had loved me enough to write me into his life, and I understood at last what Ruth meant on the porch of the dark. "It's time to tell them who you really are." I'd thought for one wild second that she meant some buried secret, some twist of blood. It was simpler and bigger than that. I was the one Walt trusted with the truth, the keeper of the books. That was who I really was, and I'd been letting them tell me I was no one. But Ruth wasn't finished, and what she said next put the weight right back on my shoulders. "A copy isn't the will, honey," she said gently. "The law presumes he tore the real one up. You'll have to prove he didn't. And I can't do that for you. You're the one who keeps the books. So keep them." After Ruth left, I didn't sleep. I sat with my legal pad and turned the problem the way Walt taught me to turn a ledger that wouldn't balance. The copy was a key, but not the door. To get my grandfather's real will honored, I'd have to petition the probate court to admit a lost or destroyed will. And to do that, I'd have to prove 3 hard things. First, that the will had been properly executed, which meant Ruth and Earl, the 2 witnesses, alive and willing to swear to it. Second, the contents, which the conformed copy could establish, page by page. And third, the wall standing in my way. I had to overcome the presumption of revocation. Because the law would assume Walt destroyed it himself, I had to show the court something better. I had to prove the original had been in someone else's hands, that someone else had the access and the motive to make it disappear. I had to prove my father took it. I wrote their names down in a column the way I'd write creditors. Ruth, the execution. Earl, the execution and the contents. Riverbend Holdings and the forged deed, the motive. And then I needed the access, the link that put the original will in Dale's hands and out of the world. That last piece I didn't have yet. I sat back and let the size of it settle on me. This wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a case, with elements and burdens and a man who'd already shown he'd forge a dying man's name to get what he wanted. I underlined Earl Dabney's name 3 times. He was the easiest piece to lose and the hardest to replace. An old man with a faded number who could vanish or die at any moment. I'd start with him. First thing. The faded number was dead, of course. So I did what paralegals do, which is the unglamorous work of finding a person who doesn't want to be found. A skip trace, public records. A cousin of a cousin who remembered Earl had moved to be near his daughter 2 states over, up in Indiana, then across into Illinois. It took 9 days and a tank of gas. I drove out on a Friday after work and found him in a tidy little ranch house with a wind chime and a flag. Earl Dabney was 81, sharp in the eyes, slow in the knees, and immediately wary the moment I said the name May. "I'm not getting in the middle of family business," he said, hand still on the screen door. I didn't push. Walt taught me you don't push a stubborn man. You set the truth in front of him and let him pick it up himself. So I just held up the conformed copy and Ruth's notary page, there on his front step, and I asked if he remembered signing. His eyes changed. He took the papers in 2 hands. He sat down right there on his porch chair and read, and when he looked up, there was water in his eyes. "I remember the day," he said. "Walt bought us all lunch after. He told me something, you know." I asked what. Earl smiled at the memory. He pointed at you through the window. You were waiting in the car, and he said, "That one out there? Avery keeps the real books." Said it like it was the proudest thing he owned. I had to look away at the field for a minute. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "If a court calls you, Earl, will you tell them what you just told me?" He thought a long while. Then he nodded. "For Walt," he said. "I'll come." Word travels fast in a small county, and somebody saw me leave town with a folder and come back lighter in the shoulders. By the time I got home, my father knew I'd found something. He didn't call. He did something worse. The following Sunday, he gathered the family at the home place again. The cousins, the aunts, Sharon's people. And he got out ahead of me, the way guilty men do. When I walked in, he was already mid-story, telling the kitchen that I'd cooked up a fake will to cheat my own grieving brother out of his inheritance, that I'd always been jealous, that I'd found some old woman to lie for me. He said it to a room full of people who'd known me since I was 9, ringing up feed sales. And the worst part was watching a few of them believe it, because he said it with such wounded confidence. I felt the old heat climb my neck, and underneath it, strangely, I heard the brass bell from the store, the sound that used to mean I was safe and home and useful. Now the same room, the same people, felt like a place I had to defend myself in. I could have screamed that he was the forger. I could have thrown the deed on the table. But I'd have been one shouting woman against a confident man, and shouting women lose those rooms. So I let the kitchen go quiet. I picked up my purse, and I said the only thing worth saying, in a voice barely above the refrigerator's hum. "Then you won't mind the court taking a look," I said. His confident face flickered just once. I walked out, and this time the screen door didn't sound like a lock. It sounded like a starting gun. Monday morning, I stopped being only a daughter and started being a petitioner. I'd handled enough of these to do the groundwork myself, and I hired a sharp probate attorney named Renata Ortiz to carry it into court, because you don't represent yourself in the fight of your life. We filed 2 things at once: a petition to admit a lost or destroyed will to probate, attaching the conformed copy and Ruth's notary page and Earl's sworn statement, and a motion to compel a full accounting and inventory from Dale as administrator, the very thing Voss had been dodging for weeks. The second one is what made the difference, and here's why. Voss could stall a grieving granddaughter's letters forever. He could not stall a court order. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Hollis who'd seen every kind of family rot cross her bench, granted the motion in a short hearing and gave Dale 21 days to produce a complete accounting. I watched Voss's jaw tighten when she said it. He'd built his whole approach on keeping the numbers in the dark, and the lights had just come on. Outside the courthouse, Renata told me to brace myself. "They'll fight the will tooth and nail," she said. "The presumption is a real hill. But that accounting, that's where people like your father trip. They can hide a will. It's a lot harder to hide what they did with the money once a judge is watching." I drove home that night with the first clean feeling I'd had in a month. Not victory. Nowhere near it. But for the first time, my father was going to have to put something in writing, and I knew, better than anyone alive, how to read what a man writes when he thinks no one's checking the math. The accounting landed on the 21st day, a thick stack of pages, and Voss clearly thought volume would hide the rot. He'd misjudged who'd be reading it. I cleared my table, made a pot of coffee, and opened it the way Walt opened the store every morning, slow and certain. It took me one evening to find the first body. Then they kept turning up. There was Riverbend Holdings again, the LLC from the forged deed, and when I pulled its registration, the registered agent traced back through a paper shell straight to my father. Dale had, in plain terms, sold estate land to himself. 2 parcels, deeded to an entity he controlled, at roughly a third of fair market value. He'd taken ground worth hundreds of thousands and moved it into his own pocket for the price of a used truck. That's not a gray area. That's a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. Self-dealing, the one thing an administrator is most forbidden to do. And it didn't stop there. He'd billed the estate administrative fees that ran 4 times anything reasonable. He'd paid Voss's firm out of estate funds for work that was really defending Dale personally. He'd let the store's insurance lapse to save a few dollars, risking the whole asset. Every page was another small theft, dressed in the costume of management. I sat back and looked at what the numbers were telling me, and it was bigger and uglier than I'd feared on that porch. He wasn't just trying to cut me out of my share. He was looting Walt's whole life and calling it grief. And I finally understood the porch for what it was. Cole's the next heir had never been a plan to enrich my brother. It was a costume. If my father had stood on those steps and announced the land was coming to him, even the cousins would have flinched. So he hid behind Cole, behind a broke young man with a newborn, because no one wants to be the villain who questions a struggling father providing for his son. Cole wasn't the heir. Cole was the shield. The land was never meant for my brother any more than it was meant for me. It was meant for Riverbend Holdings, and Riverbend Holdings was Dale. I felt something harden in me, but it wasn't rage. Rage is loud and useless. This was the clean, quiet certainty of a column that finally balances. I picked up a fresh legal pad, and for each violation I wrote the entry, the statute, and the page number, building the exhibit that would walk into Judge Hollis's courtroom and speak for itself. I know a lot of you are watching this thinking about your own family, about the paperwork nobody else wanted to read. Stay with me. We're almost at the part where the quiet bookkeeper finally opens the ledger in a room full of people. If you believe the truth deserves a hearing, hit subscribe, and let's keep going. Cole found me before I found him. He showed up after dark. No pie this time, just a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the porch. He sat on the step outside my apartment instead of coming in, like he wasn't sure he'd earn the indoors. "I signed things, Avery," he said to the parking lot. "I didn't read them. Dad said it was just procedure. He told me I was the heir and you were taken care of, and I was so tired I just signed." I let him talk. I'd been so ready to count him among the guilty, and here he was, another person my father had walked through a stack of papers in the dark. The baby, the debt, the exhaustion. Dale had found the exact crack to slide a pen into, but I'd promised myself I wouldn't go soft just because the wound made sense. So I went inside and brought out the accounting, and I set it on the step between us under the porch light. I showed him River Bend. I showed him the third-rate price on Walt's best ground. I showed him the lapsed insurance on the store where we'd both grown up. I watched my little brother read what our father had actually done, not to me, but to the man who'd taught us both to ring that bell. When he looked up, his face had come apart. "If that's real," he said, voice cracking, "then what does that make me?" I didn't rush to comfort him. Some questions a man has to sit in. I just told him the truth, the only mercy I had to offer. "It makes you someone who got used, Cole. The same as me. The difference from here on is what you do once you know." And I left him sitting on that step with the numbers, and I let the night do the rest. My father's side didn't surrender. They got smarter and meaner. Voss filed a motion to dismiss the will petition, and he aimed it straight at my weakest point, the presumption of revocation. His argument was clean and cruel. No original will had ever been produced. Under the law, a will last in the testator's control that cannot be found is presumed revoked by the testator himself. A photocopy and 2 old witnesses, he wrote, could establish what the will once said, but could not prove Walt hadn't simply changed his mind and torn it up before he died. Without proof someone else made it disappear, the petition should fail, and the estate should pass as if there were no will at all. It was a wall, and Renata didn't sugarcoat it. "He's right about the law," she said. "Judges follow that presumption hard. We can prove the will existed and what it said. What we cannot yet prove is that your father had it and destroyed it. Right now we've got motive, the deed, the money. We do not have access. We can't put that original will in Dale's hands, and without that link, Avery, we lose." I drove home gripping the wheel. They'd boxed me into the one corner I couldn't argue my way out of with a copy and 2 good people. I needed a fact, a hard physical fact that connected my father to the original document in a way no jury could wave off. Where had Walt kept it? Not in the lawyer's office that had closed. He'd have kept the original close, at the home place, in the one spot he trusted. And the moment I thought it, I knew exactly where, because I'd seen him spin the dial 100 times. The old floor safe in the office off the kitchen. I reached for my phone. The safe was a heavy old thing bolted into the floor of Walt's office, behind the desk where he paid the feed bills. He kept his important papers there, the deeds, his discharge from the army, the photo of my grandmother. If the original will existed in the world, that's where it had been. But the safe was at the home place now, and the home place was my father's fortress. I couldn't get to it. What I could get to was history, because small towns keep receipts whether they mean to or not. I started calling locksmiths. There aren't many in our county. The 3rd one I reached remembered the job right away, because you don't forget being called out to a grieving family's home. He'd been hired to drill and replace the lock on an old floor safe at the May place. The customer's name on the work order was Dale May, and the date stopped my breath, was 11 days after my grandfather's funeral. 11 days. Long enough to grieve. Long enough to open a safe with a combination only Walt knew, find what was inside, and decide he didn't like it. Then call a man to change the lock so no one could ever check what had been in there before. I sat very still and let the pieces lock into place. Walt kept the will in the safe. Only Dale had the access after Walt died. 11 days later, Dale changed the lock. "He didn't lose the will," I said to my empty kitchen. "He opened the safe, took it out, and changed the lock behind him." I called Renata at 9 at night and she actually laughed, the tired, fierce laugh of someone who's just been handed the missing brick. "That," she said, "is your access. That's the wall coming down." We had 3 weeks to build it into something a court couldn't ignore, and I worked those weeks like Walt worked the harvest, every daylight hour and most of the dark ones. We subpoenaed the locksmith's work order, dated and signed. We secured Ruth's notary journal, the original logbook, and her sworn testimony. We arranged for Earl to make the drive, and I called him twice a week just to keep him steady and let him know he mattered. Renata assembled the accounting into a clean exhibit of self-dealing, my entries beside each statute, page numbers tabbed. And the conformed copy of the will sat at the center of it all, the thing my grandfather had signed while I waited in the car. I practiced too. Not arguments. Renata would handle those. I practiced staying calm. Because I knew my father, and I knew that in a room with his back to the wall, he would do what he always did. He would get loud. And the worst thing I could do was match him. Ruth came by the night before with a tin of cookies and advice worth more than the cookies. Say it plain, she told me. Don't decorate it. Let the paper shout so you don't have to. I wrote that on the top of my notes. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, and word had gone around the county, so it wasn't going to be a quiet docket. The aunts were coming, the cousins, a few of the old store hands who'd known Walt for 50 years and wanted to see how it landed. My father had turned my grandfather's death into a performance on a porch in front of the family. Now the family was going to watch the books get read out loud, in a room where the truth had a referee. Thursday morning, the courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old radiators, and it was full of my family. The aunts clustered on one bench, cousins I hadn't spoken to since the porch wouldn't meet my eyes, and there, near the courtroom doors, was my father, in his good suit, with Garrett Voss beside him looking smooth and certain. Dale had the posture of a man who still thought he was running the room. When he saw me, he made sure the hallway could hear him. Still chasing your fairy tale, he said. You won't get a single cent. He said it just like the porch, the exact words, like a man who'd found a line he loved and couldn't stop saying it. A few heads turned. He smiled, satisfied, certain the repetition made it true. I didn't answer. I had a thin folder under my arm and Walt's green ledger in my other hand, the actual ledger, the one I'd kept since I was 11, brought along not as evidence but as ballast, something of my grandfather's to hold. Cole stood off to the side, apart from Dad for the first time in my memory, pale and undecided, a man standing in a doorway he hadn't chosen yet. Renata touched my elbow. Ready? She asked. I looked at my father's confident face, and at the people he'd convinced, and at the brother trying to decide who he was, and I felt the strange calm I'd been practicing finally arrive for real. Not numbness. Certainty. The certainty of a column you've checked twice. Ready, I said. We went in. The bailiff called the case. Judge Hollis took the bench, looked over the crowded gallery without surprise, and said the words I'd been driving toward for 2 months. Let's hear from the petitioner's witnesses. Ruth Halloran went first, and the gallery learned in about 4 minutes why you don't underestimate a woman who's notarized 1,000 documents. She took the stand in her sensible coat, and Renata walked her through it gently. 31 years as Harold Pruitt's notary. The day 6 years ago when Walter May came in to sign his will. Ruth produced her original notary journal, a worn ledger of her own, and read the entry aloud. The date, the document, a last will and testament. Walt's signature, witnessed. Her stamp, her seal, logged in sequence between a power of attorney and a property deed she'd notarized the same afternoon. It was mundane, and that's exactly what made it bulletproof. This wasn't a dramatic memory that could be shaken. It was a contemporaneous business record, kept by a public officer in the ordinary course, the kind of evidence courts trust above almost anything. When Voss rose to cross-examine, he tried to suggest she couldn't possibly recall one signing among thousands. Ruth looked at him the way my grandmother used to look at a man tracking mud on her clean floor. I don't recall it, she said. I recorded it. That's the entire point of the journal. The gallery made a small sound, almost a laugh, quickly swallowed. Voss tried another angle, asking whether the document she logged might have been something other than a will. Ruth tapped the page. It says will, she said. I wrote it. I don't guess on my seal. He sat down. I watched my father's certain expression develop its first hairline crack, because Dale had been counting on the whole thing resting on a granddaughter's grudge, and instead it was resting on a notary's logbook and a public seal. Renata thanked Ruth and turned to the bench. "The petitioner calls Earl Dabney," she said. And the courtroom door opened, and an 81-year-old man walked in slow and steady to keep a promise to a friend. Earl Dabney made that long walk to the stand, and you could have heard a pin drop, because half the people in that room had bought feed from him 30 years back. He swore his oath in a voice like gravel and gave the court something Ruth's journal couldn't: the human texture of the day. He'd worked Walt's store for 2 decades. Walt had asked him to come witness an important signing, bought everyone lunch after. He remembered the conformed copy when Renata showed it to him, remembered the gist of what Walt had wanted: the store and the home place held by his 2 grandkids, a fair share to his son. He remembered because Walt had talked about it over the lunch, proud and a little emotional, the way men of that generation got only once or twice a life. And then Renata asked if Walt had said anything in particular that stuck with him, and Earl looked right at me in the gallery. He pointed out the window at the parking lot, Earl said. His granddaughter was waiting in the car. And he said, "That one out there. Avery keeps the real books." He said it was the proudest thing he had. The room went very quiet. I felt my eyes sting, and I did not let them spill, because I'd promised myself I would stay the calm one. Voss tried to rattle him, suggested an old man's memory wasn't reliable, leaned on his age. Earl just shrugged. "I'm 81, son," he said. "I'm not dead, and I'm not a liar. I held 2 things in my life I never broke: my word and Walt May's trust. I'm here on both." Even Judge Hollis allowed herself the ghost of a smile. 2 witnesses down, the will's existence and its contents standing solid on the record. There was only the wall left now, the presumption, and everyone in that room knew it. The wall was my father. Then it was my turn, and I want you to understand, I did not raise my voice once. Renata called me, and I took the stand with my thin folder, and I did the thing Walt trained into me before I could drive. I let the paper shout. First, the locksmith's work order entered into evidence, projected for the gallery. The job: drilling and replacing the lock on the floor safe at the May home place. The customer: Dale May. The date: 11 days after the funeral. I explained, in the flattest voice I owned, that my grandfather kept his important papers in that safe, that only Dale had access to the home after Walt died, and that a man does not change a lock to keep things in. He changes it to control who can ever look. Then the deed to Riverbend Holdings, and the registry pulling its ownership back to my father, the estate's own land sold to himself at 1/3 of its worth. Then the accounting, page by quiet page, the inflated fees, the lapsed insurance, the legal bills for defending Dale charged to Walt's estate. I read the entries the way I'd read a feed order: calm, exact, no adjectives. The gallery was dead silent. And when I'd laid the last page down, I let myself say the one thing that wasn't strictly evidence, looking not at the judge, but at my father, and I set Walt's green ledger gently on the rail in front of me. "You taught me the books don't lie," I said. "People do. This is the page you forgot to change." For one heartbeat, the whole room held still. My father had spent 2 months telling everyone I was a jealous girl with a fairy tale. Now there was a work order with his name on it, a deed with his name on it, and a column of his own thefts, written in his own administrator's hand, and not one of them could be cross-examined into doubt. The presumption of revocation needs an honest man who simply lost a paper. It cannot survive a man who changed the lock. I closed the folder, and across the room, my father stood up out of his chair. He came apart exactly the way I knew he would, and the calmer I stayed, the worse he looked doing it. Voss put a hand on his arm and Dale shook it off. He turned to the gallery, to the family, his voice climbing. "She's twisting everything," he shouted. "She always thought she was better than this family." The judge told him to sit. He didn't. "That land was as good as mine," he said, louder. "I gave my whole life to that store while she played with a pencil." "Sit down, Mr. May," Judge Hollis said, sharper. But he was past hearing it, decades of being his father's second choice pouring out in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. I only fixed what should have been mine in the first place, he said. The old man never should have put that girl over his own son. And there it was. In a room full of witnesses. On the record, my father had just told a probate judge that he'd fixed his own father's estate, that he'd corrected a will he claimed never existed. Voss shut his eyes. You cannot argue a will was never written, and in the same breath rage that you fixed it. Judge Hollis let the silence hang one beat, then ordered him into his seat. And this time the bailiff took a step and Dale sat, chest heaving, finally understanding what his own mouth had done. I hadn't said a word through any of it. I didn't need to. I'd spent my whole life being told my quiet was weakness, and in that courtroom my quiet was the loudest thing in the room. The man who shamed me on a porch had just shamed himself in front of the only audience that could hold him to it. Judge Hollis looked at the gallery, at Cole half risen from his seat, and asked if there was anyone else who wished to be heard. Cole stood up. I think it surprised him as much as anyone. He asked the judge if he could speak, and his voice shook, but he didn't sit back down. He told the court he was Dale's son and Walt's grandson, and that he'd signed papers supporting his father's appointment without reading them because he'd been told it was procedure, and he'd been too broke and too tired to argue. He said he believed now the will was real. He said he didn't want land that came from a forged deed and a changed lock. He withdrew his support for Dale's appointment right there on the record and asked that his grandfather's actual wishes be honored. It cost him something, doing that, standing up against the only parent who'd offered him a lifeline. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. Judge Hollis took a short recess and came back and ruled from the bench, plainly, the way good judges do. She found the will's execution proven by Ruth and Earl, its contents established by the conformed copy, and the presumption of revocation overcome by clear evidence that the original had been in Dale's exclusive control, and that his conduct, the changed lock, the self-dealing, was inconsistent with any innocent loss. She admitted Walter J. May's will to probate. She removed Dale as administrator effective immediately. She ordered a full surcharge for the self-dealt land and improper fees, meaning he'd have to pay the estate back, and she referred the matter, the forged deed, the concealment, to the county prosecutor for review. She did not promise charges. The law doesn't work that fast or that sure. But she opened the door. My grandfather's true wishes were the law again, and the bell I'd been hearing in my head all those weeks finally went quiet, because I didn't need it anymore. The aftermath was quieter than the movies make it look, and that suited me fine. The will was probated as Walt wrote it. The store and the home place came to Cole and me, jointly, the way my grandfather wanted, and Dale received the cash share Walt had set aside for him, not a cent more. The 2 parcels he'd deeded to himself came back into the estate under the surcharge order, and paying it back hurt him in the only place he'd ever really felt things. Garrett Voss is answering to the state bar now for the fees he billed and the corners he cut, and last I heard he was very interested in settling quietly. The prosecutor's review is still open. It may go nowhere, these things often do. But my father has learned that a changed lock leaves a work order, and that some receipts outlive the men who order them. As for the family that watched my father carve me out of Walt's life on that porch, a few of them found their voices afterward and called to apologize. I was gracious. I am, after all, my grandfather's bookkeeper, and I've learned you can hold a person accountable without holding a grudge. The two are not the same thing, no matter how the loud ones tell it. I reopened May Brothers Feed and Grain on the first Saturday in November. I oiled the hinges and swept the grain dust and put the green ledger back on the counter where it belonged. When I unlocked the front door and stepped through, the brass bell rang, and for the first time in months it sounded like it used to, like coming home, like being useful, like a girl of 9 who'd just been handed something to keep. Cole runs the yard now and does it well, sober and steady in a way the crisis seemed to knock into him. But I set one boundary the day we signed the partnership, and I meant it. The books stay honest, I told him, or you stay out. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, the way you nod at something true. We're not the family we were, my brother and I. We're something smaller and more careful, and, I think, more real. The door's open between us, but it locks from the inside now, and we both know where the key is. My grandfather was right about the only thing that ever really mattered, that the books don't lie, and neither should the people who keep them. And it took me 34 years and one stolen estate to understand that being the quiet one in the family was never, not once, the same thing as being the weak one. That's my story. One sneer at a graveside, one envelope from a stranger, and one ledger that finally got read out loud. If this reminded you to ask where the will really is, or to read what you're about to sign, take that as your sign and do it today. And if you know someone who's always been the quiet one, share this with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.